be fine. So we spoke initially in our first lecture about history, about colonialism, about the start of slavery and the way that power around the globe was reorganized along certain lines, and people were kind of positioned in different ways. They start to relate to each other differently. They start to relate to themselves differently, and they have new ideas about what it means to be to have a mind, what it means to have a body. In our second lecture, we got more into the way that context plays into psychiatry itself, and how it influences Kraepelin and what we have there as a DSM, as well as different ways that social attitudes influence and shape diagnoses, right, and mental illness. And today we're going to talk about psychoanalysis specifically, okay, psychodynamic theory, and in particular this idea that is actually a very old idea that predates psychoanalysis. The idea of being alienated from yourself, okay? So alienation. And we're going to kind of track that through different psychoanalytic schools and how it was thought about, and then also maybe take a more liberatory lens into how to engage with this clinical problem, okay? So we'll start off with this quote here from a book called Invisible Man by Ralph Ellison. And let me just minimize this over here. Okay. And it's a quote about invisibility. Okay, I'm invisible simply because people refuse to see me. It is as though I've been surrounded by mirrors of hard, distorting glass. Invisibility is a matter of their inner eyes, those eyes with which they look through their physical eyes upon reality. Okay, so what's being described here is in a very kind of poignant way, is actually in some ways clinically useful for us to take seriously, take you through that. So being seen and not being invisible is a very important part of growing up and becoming a person with a sense of self, with a healthy sense of self. This is something that occurs throughout childhood, where the child is looking for ways that they're being reflected, right? There's like they're looking for reflections of themselves in society, the way that they think of themselves. They want to see what others think of them, and this is kind of a process that they're constantly doing, and it's very important for development. And you have Erikson's stages of psychosocial development, and he talks about a number of different stages throughout the lifespan. The child is coming to terms with society in a specific way. There's like this interaction with the social surround, and certain problems are being worked out. So in early childhood, there's a question on the child's mind, which is it okay to be me? Okay, and if the response from the environment is yes, then they develop autonomy, they develop self-confidence and self-esteem. And if the answer is no, and it's a subtle kind of messaging from caregivers and from the culture, then what develops is a sense of shame and self-doubt. Okay, in preschool, the child is carrying this question of in preschool, the child is carrying the question of where am I get to in life? Like, what does the future hold for me? Like, am I going to be able to contribute something? And if they get responses that are encouraging, if they receive recognition for their achievements, then that helps them become industrious. It helps them be hardworking. And if the answer is no, and they get a lot of negative feedback and they're discouraged, they develop a sense of inferiority. Okay. in adolescence, when the child or the adolescent is trying to explore who they are, if that gets shut down, or they're asked to conform to certain views of themselves and of how things are like, then that can result in identity confusion. They're going to be kind of uncertain about who they are. Okay. So Erikson is talking about this, like this kind of dynamic interplay between the individual and the surround, and how there's a negotiation that happens that is very vital for the person's like self-esteem and their sense of self and who they are. Jessica, do you have your hand raised? Feel free to just unmute and talk, okay? No, you don't have to raise your hands. Okay.
I don't think they can see your screen.
Really?
Yeah. I think you have to resume share.
Oh,
I think they're seeing your email.
oh.
Yeah, we're seeing your inbox.
Oh, okay. That's not. Okay.
Now go back to your slide.
Okay.
Make sure it's on. Yeah, you might have to stop sharing.
Hit resume.
Maybe stop sharing and reshare, because I think you're showing that window.
Oh, so now they can see my conversation with Dunkley.
Yeah. So you need to stop sharing, I think, and then you need to do a new share. Is that right?
Okay, stop share.
And then share screen again.
Now we share the screen.
Yeah. The green one. The green one in the. And yeah, do your PowerPoint.
And then go to the PowerPoint. That's it.
Is this okay?
Yeah.
So now we're
You got
good.
it. You got it.
Okay. Cool. Sorry to leave the Zoom people hanging on that one. Okay, so okay, another person that we spoke about in our psychodynamic lectures on Tuesdays was Kohut. Did you all talk about him with Patsman?
Yeah, in the beginning, it's been really.
In the very beginning, yeah. Gotcha.
The name's familiar.
Yeah. So probably in the beginning. He's the guy who talks about self-psychology, and for him, the most important task for a person throughout life is developing self-coherence, like a self that is coherent. And for Kohut, the environment that the child grows up in is very important to achieve this, to actually get a sense of self that's coherent, right? And the way that happens is through like like validation in some ways, right? Through being recognized as a valuable human being, right? So if that's happening in the child's environment, in the child's early environment, and they're getting this sense of connection, they're getting the sense that they're valuable, then they can grow up to be have a cohesive sense of self. Okay, and he was really emphatic that the environment has to reflect back to the child their sense of themselves, and that's how they can start to feel more real and more seen, and that's kind of just, they get the acceptance and love that they need in order to exist as a sense of a sense of self. Okay. So what I'm trying to say here is like if you grow up like in the forest with nobody around you to reflect back who you are to you, you're not going to be aware of yourself in a way that you are, otherwise. When there are people, like, basically, in order for you to come to an awareness of yourself, you need to know how other people are aware of you. Okay, so there's something very natural about the child looking for themselves in other people's minds. So in order for them to get an understanding of who they are, they look at how you understand them.
Thanks for saying the bar low for parenting. I just need to be better than the forest.
Yeah. Yes. Just recognize your kids, exist, and you'll be okay. But no, like on that point, like ideally, like you want to provide enough attunement and enough, you want to see your child for who they are. So like the child does something or feels something or has a desire and they don't know what it is until you as their parents kind of verbalize it and reflect it back to them and kind of tell them what's on their mind. So they start to understand themselves through their interaction with you, right? And then oftentimes there are parents who, for whatever reason, they can't really see their kid for who their kid is. Like they have a lot going on and they're constantly maybe projecting certain ideas about who they think the kid should be or kind of misinterpreting things. And that can be really bad for a kid. So I'll give you like a funny example of something that happened with me when I was when I was in the 7th grade. And it's kind of like a nice example of how this thing can go wrong, right? It's kind of a benign example. I was in the 2nd grade, and I grew up in Jordan. I'm Palestinian, but I grew up in Jordan. And we have like this system between friends, like kids, where if you want to be friends with another kid, you go like this. You give them a thumbs up, and this means I'm friends with you, like literally, like very concrete. But something bad happens, like whatever, like they betrayed you or you don't want to be their friends anymore. You give them the pinky. You go like this. This means like I'm not friends with you anymore. This is like a language system,
Is that like offensive? Or
It's
no?
not. It's
It's
just
just
very.
like a lot.
It's just this is like I'm not friends with you, and this is friends with you. Okay. And I have this friend. I have this guy. His name is Najati, and I don't know what he did, but he messed with me or something. And I was like, you know what? Like I don't like this Najati guy. And I stood up like I was in the 2nd grade. I stood up in class, and I don't know. Like I just remember this. I remember this memory because I was like very young, and there was something about that setting where I was like, I want to like give him the pinky. Like I was like, this guy is no longer my friend. But I stood up and it was a little bit dramatic, and I can see like the teacher was looking at me and I was like, maybe I shouldn't go all the way. Maybe there's something to preserve here. I'll just go halfway. So I gave him the middle finger. And I was like, this is between ending the relationship. It's like I'm like halfway in, halfway out. Like I'm not sure about you right now. That's what I was trying to say to him, right? Like that's what I'm trying to make a sophisticated comment about the kind of relationship to have with this guy. So I'm giving him a middle finger as a 7th grader in this class in front of this teacher, and she freaks the hell out. Like I remember her reaction, like she freaked the hell out, and there was like no containing it. She was like, "What's wrong? Like what is this? What's wrong with you?" And I was like, "What?" Like it means I'm half friends, half not friends. And she was like, and her reaction was like so overblown. I was like so confused, right? And like I left that interaction kind of feeling like this kind of vague sense of badness, right? There's something wrong with my spontaneity, right? So that's something interesting happened there. And I'm reading this book called Black Boy by Richard Wright, and he talks about like this interesting situation where like a young kid who's a bit of a troublemaker, his grandma is kind of like this very orthodox, kind of very Christian, kind of rigid lady. She's like washing him, and while she's washing him, and he makes kind of like this dirty comment, right? And he doesn't know what he's saying. He's just a kid. But the grandma's reaction is like so overblown, and she kind of beats him, and it's like horrible. And what happens to him is like he has like this sense that there's something, there's like a nameless wrong. He's like filled with like this unatonable guilt, and it comes up in his life in different times. It kind of becomes like this kind of it becomes a threat to be like yourself in a spontaneous way, right? So like these are kind of interesting examples of where mentalization, right, or when the kid wasn't seen for who they are, right, and then that has bad effects. For me, I'm good. Like that was like a nice funny example, right? But the thing about this is kind of happening chronically at a very important way with like your parents, right? What happens is that you essentially stop becoming spontaneous, right? That becomes a threat. Yeah.
What age are you talking about?
So we're going to get more into that. There are different theories and different people. This is you can think of it as happening honestly like throughout adolescence. Like that.
Yeah.
And you're saying like the example is like you're projecting a thought or an opinion or whatever, but the reaction you're getting from others is like they're misunderstanding.
You see yourself in a particular way. The way that other people see you is very different.
Okay.
And
And you can
that's-
tell this just by their like,
And that's jarring.
right.
And you can tell that by what they say to you, by how they think about you. Because as a child, you're always looking around,
Yeah,
like, who am I?
the way they're treating you.
The way they're treating you. And this happens also like at a wider cultural level, like socially. Like this is not just mom and dad. This is watching the TV, seeing how people that look like you, how they're talked about, what roles they play, right? It's like a wider thing. The stories, right? You have stories about cowboys and Indians, and somehow like the good guys are the cowboys, and you got to kind of identify with the cowboys, even though you might be native or something, right? So like there are these very kind of wider mirroring that happens at a social level, and it affects the way that you see yourself. It affects the self that you develop. Okay. There's this one interesting study that gets cited in Brown versus Board of Education, which is like 1954 court case for kind of segregated education. And it's a famous study that gets cited. It's about the children's preferences for their dolls, and even Black children preferred lighter skinned dolls, right? And this was cited as like an example of how like horrible kind of racism is, and how ultimately like you're gonna make an identification, you're gonna make a choice of, of what's being what being good is like, right? And we're like negotiating your place in society, and this can conflict with who you are, right? And that creates a huge problem for you. That's an example of internalized racism too, right? Like you get split against yourself. The images that are presented that are supposed to be you are so at odds with who you are. If you identify with them, you end up kind of internalizing something racist about yourself. Okay.
Is this, what particular theory was this right from?
Which one?
Was
So
it
look there, false self.
the false self?
Yes. So Donald Winnicott, who I think you all should also be reading about in your Tuesday lectures. There's this article called False Self, and he's talking about this exact issue, but he's more interested in early infancy. Okay, early infancy. There is basically a baby, an infant who has kind of like these spontaneous desires and gestures, like they want food, like they cry or whatever. And if mom is a good enough mother, in Winnicott's terms, the caregiver would be able to respond in a fairly spontaneous way, and if this happens kind of seamlessly and nicely and smoothly, the infant starts to experience their desires and their needs and their gestures as being real, important, and meaningful. Okay. And if for whatever reason there isn't a good enough environment for the infant, what happens is the child might start to face demands from the external world, and they're not just concerned with themselves and what's coming up for them. They have to kind of contend with things that are happening in their reality, in their world, and that gets in the way of them developing like a subjectivity, of them developing like who they are as a person. So another way to think about this is the child should be able to develop like a sense of me, because they have all of these kind of spontaneous desires that are being kind of fulfilled. And but if that's not happening, and they have to contend with the external environment for whatever reason, then they start to become aware of their expectations and their external stimuli. So instead of me, it becomes mother's son, right? And so what happens there is they become oriented towards others' expectations and the external environment. They're no longer at the center of their subjective experience. It's like they're always looking at themselves and the world through somebody else's eyes. Okay. So this gets in the way of them being able to live authentically. Whatever they're doing, they're kind of doing it based on maybe what they think what they should be doing, right? And that's like the false self. There's like a facade that comes up, and it's keeping you from being authentic, and it's rooted at a very early level for Winnicott, where your own spontaneous and kind of inner kind of needs and desires are not being attended to. They're getting frustrated, right? So that's something that can stay with you. Okay. Others have elaborated on this idea. This is Bernard Brandchaft. He's an intersubjective psychoanalyst, also pathological accommodation. And what he's describing in this is not necessarily early infancy. This is more broad, and this can happen later in the person's life. Let's say mom or dad or the caregiver, they're depressed or whatever, something is going on. They need something from the kid, or they're not really available to them, right? And we know, like, attachment is a very important. It's like a hardwired drive in the children. Attachment needs to happen. Okay, it has to happen somehow, because it's linked with survival. So if let's say the parent is depressed and the child is kind of put in this situation where, in order for them to be attached to the parent, then they have to kind of fulfill some kind of need for the parent, maybe to be charming, right? Maybe to try to help, right? So what happens there is that attachment becomes contingent on an accommodation. In order for you to be attached, to be in a loving relationship with somebody that you depend on and you care about, you have to give up something about your psychological distinctness, right? So now you're kind of attuned to your caregiver's psychology, their state, what's going on with them, and you're trying to orient yourself so that you can accommodate them, support them, help them, be something for them, right? So you're existing for them. In a way, this is happening at the expense of you, right? This is happening at the expense of your own personal growth, your own authenticity, your self-differentiation. Okay, and this is something that you can carry on in your life. It's something that you learn unconsciously. You did it to survive. You didn't do it because you wanted to. So it becomes kind of like a procedural memory. You know, you have declarative memory, which is more kind of general knowledge about the world, like maybe autobiographical stuff, this stored in the hippocampus. And then you have procedural memory, right, which is unconscious. You don't really retrieve it, and it's in a different region. It's in the basal ganglia. So this is happening at that level. The way that your pattern of response to the environment is more of the procedural memory, and it's kind of very deep and unconscious. Okay, and you take that with you in your entire life, right? So this happens when you're young, but you might start to end up being in relationships where you don't feel like you can say what's on your mind, right? Or you don't feel like there's like this problem. You can't really be authentic, and and it has big implications for like your sense of vitality, your sense of meaning, and it can really be damaging to a person. Okay, and and it also results in like some self-defeating patterns too, because again, you're in very severe cases, you're not at the center of your subjective experience. So like, I'm sitting here, I can feel this chair against my body, and I'm in this body and I'm thinking these things, right? I'm at the center of my subjective experience. For some people, they'll be way more attuned and paying so much more attention to what's going on with other people all the time. So they're almost like they're literally like their second by second actions are kind of, but while looking through another person's eyes at themselves. So think about like that level of kind of false self, right? That's like a very deep alienation from yourself. Okay, and again, this idea is an old idea. Think back to 1933 with a paper called Confusion of Tongues. This is Sandor Ferenzci, And he talked about something called identification with the aggressor. And it's kind of the same thing that we're talking about. This is kind of like the pathological accommodation, the false self stuff. And he says this, he says the undeveloped personality reacts to sudden unpleasure, not by defense, but by anxiety-ridden identification and by introjection of the menacing person or aggressor. Through the identification, or let us say introjection of the aggressor disappears as part of external reality and becomes intrapsychic instead of extrapsychic. Okay. So there is a traumatizing person, a traumatogenic object, and the victimized internalizes this person in their mind. So it becomes like whatever the aggressor wants, victim also wants and fulfills. So again, what you get here is like the splitting of the ego. So the victim becomes both victim and aggressor. So kind of complicated stuff. Let me give you a benign example of how this happens. Also something happened to me, like very, very benign, simple thing, but this is a huge, huge, devastating topic. But just to illustrate it simplistically. So I was at the dentist, right? And I'm extracting my wisdom teeth. And you know, they put the anesthetic, and I was like mumbling my words, and like I couldn't feel anything, and sat down, and the doctor was like this nice Southern doctor, and you know, took out this, I don't know, what is it, like a forceps? I don't even know. It was like this very savage procedure. I wasn't like, honestly, I wasn't ready for it. So he puts it in my mouth, right? And he starts to like yank it. It's like, and I'm like sitting there, I'm like, I have to do this, right? Like but I kind of got this kind of really shitty feeling, like this powerlessness, this helplessness, and like this kind of really. So what I did there, like just because it just didn't feel good to be sitting there, I kind of started to imagine, like, you know, like, yeah, like get that tooth out of there. I did that in my mind. So I was like, kind of like identifying with this dentist who was making me feel helpless and uncomfortable. I was like, no, we're both here to get this, you know, tooth out, and I don't need this tooth. But it was driven by this kind of anxiety-ridden kind of sense of helplessness, right? And you can kind of see yourself doing that in certain instances where like it's very intolerable to be in this situation where you're powerless and you feel like you can't really protest, right? So what you do is you take on and you identify with the aggressor, right? This is a very simple example. I'm good. I removed the wisdom teeth. I'm cool with that, doctor. But like that's like a simple kind of outline of a psychological process that happens. Okay. And if you can imagine that happening all the time, right? Then that's kind of like a split within yourself against yourself. Okay.
That's a little bit like what starts to develop with a person like with sexual trauma who then goes on to like perform sexual trauma or makes sense.
I think I get.
Sorry,
what you're
yeah, I know I didn't use enough words. Yeah, so if an individual experiences certain like sexual trauma,
Yeah.
and then the higher there is a likelihood that they will go on to perpetrate sexual trauma. It's kind of like
Sure, it's a reaction to trauma. It's a reaction to an aggressor, and people can react to it in many different ways. And I can imagine, yeah, sexual trauma.
Yeah, I was thinking like similar, but like those who go on to, you know, prostitute themselves or I guess find themselves engaged in relationships that allow their partner to take advantage of them sexually, almost sort of tricking themselves into thinking, I want this,
That's
like
what they
this, right? Or pornography,
yeah.
right? All those kind of things.
Yeah. Right.
Well,
And a lot of people say that Freud didn't think about like social stuff, but there's like some very consistent and illuminating writings about the dynamics between oppressor and oppressed, and how this identification with the aggressor kind of takes root in certain ways, right? So society reflects the desires of a wealthy few who acquire control over the distribution of wealth, right? So there's a lot of wealth that's controlled by not a lot of people. Right? I think there are some statistics in the US. It's like a crazy number. It's like, what is it? I don't even know. I think
It's
it's
like about
2/3 of the wealth generated since 2020 is owned by like
the top 10%, but then
1%.
1% is a third, and then the other third
Yeah.
is like the remaining 10%.
Right.
So that's this 90% that's the remaining third.
Crazy. Yeah. 1/3 has as much as the top 3 people, I think. It's like that. It's like really insane. Whatever, but
Yeah.
you get the point. The point
Yeah.
is, like the vast wealth is held by a minority. And people have kind of always asked, like, what's going on? Like, why is it that the people who don't have much, why don't they like rebel and try to get it? And the reason why is because they start to see like in their oppressors, they start to see their ideals, right? It's kind of like the temporarily embarrassed millionaire, that myth, like and then historically too, like race was used as like a very powerful tool for this purpose. When there was basically to quell kind of solidarity between working class and enslaved people of color, the white working class was told, even though you're oppressed, you're still white, right? And so like they have this illusion that one day if they work hard enough or whatever, they can become like the white landowners, right? So that was kind of like identification with the aggressor, where conditions were actually created in order to get that to happen, and the white working class would displace their envy and their hatred onto the excluded third of like people of color, women, and they become kind of the source of their problems, as opposed to their oppressors, who they kind of see, who they look up to, right? So that's like an interesting example of the way that it plays out, and there's a lot of interesting writing on it psychoanalytically. I'm getting this from Daniel Gastenbide's book, which I recommended to you all at the beginning of the year, People's History of Psychoanalysis. Really good stuff. Okay, and so what you're getting here is that there's like the system of inequality that gets internalized, and that's how the status quo gets maintained. Okay. Some of the ideas that we're talking about today are, they predate psychoanalysis. W.E.B. Du Bois wrote about double consciousness in like 1903, way before any psychoanalyst talked about it. And he describes it like this. I'm just going to read this quote here. It is a peculiar sensation, this double consciousness, this sense of always looking at oneself through the eyes of others, of measuring one's soul by the tape of a world that looks on in amused contemplating. Okay. Yeah. So there's an oppressor within, right? There are warring ideals. And this has been written about a lot more by different decolonial psychoanalysts. Frantz Fanon is the Martinican psychiatrist, and he has a book called Black Skin, White Masks, and he talks a lot about the way that for colonized people and people in Africa in particular, who he was concerned about, there was this desire to become white, right? There was this desire to like turn white or disappear. And he talks about the way that societies have a way of managing their aggression, like there's a collective catharsis. And as kids who like read stories about just different stories about, like we're saying, like cowboys and Indians, or and like even for me in Jordan, like just playing games where you're like the US and you're kind of invading Iraq. All of these things, like as a kid, you want to identify with the good guys, right? And so what happens there is you start to identify with your oppressor, right? Basically, the idea is that if the world is cruel to you, you start being cruel to you as well. And yeah, so you're getting this sense that there are many different ways that a person can get split against themselves. They can inauthenticity in some ways gets pressured. In some cases, it's like almost impossible to for your own safety. And there's this social and cultural context is very important for this, right? A lot of psychoanalysts thought mostly about the environment, like the nuclear family, but this happens at a wider social level. I want to make sure we get to watch the video from the ISTDP so we can look at how this happens clinically. I'm gonna play like a very specific part, and we can try to basically stop reading my email.
11,600. That doesn't stress you out. It stressed me out just seeing it.
I've read every single one.
Yeah. Those specifically the unread ones. So I'm sure you have.
Mark says I'm ready. Go back.
Exactly.
They're not really important.
Last week.
I don't think Andrea is here to stop the recording, but we'll stop the recording.